Good afternoon. Uh, we are at the Institute for Latino Studies. It's Wednesday, November 6th in the afternoon. I am Misael. I'm an MFA poetry student, and I'm here to interview Juan Morales. Thank you for this opportunity.
Well, thank you for the opportunity as well.
So I think we will start by asking you about your origin. Who are you? Where did you come from? Tell us about your heritage.
Absolutely. So I was born. I was born in Iowa City, Iowa, from a Puerto Rican father and an Ecuadorian mother, and the reason why I was born in Iowa is because there was a 2-year period where my father was stationed at the University of Iowa. So there's an interesting irony connected to the kind of writing path and being at the University of Iowa as a child, as a baby. And then from there, I moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado, and I lived there until I was about 18. And I'm a first-generation college student, so I went to college. It was at the time called the University of Southern Colorado, which became Colorado State University Pueblo, where I did I had my bachelor's of English, and then I went on to graduate school at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, in New Mexico. And I returned to Pueblo, Colorado, and was able to secure a teaching position at Colorado State University Pueblo, and I've risen through the various ranks there, and that's where I teach right now.
We could say that you grew up in university towns, much as you grew up in being a military brat.
Absolutely, yeah. There's definitely a mixture of it's similar to kind of like when you're not like in a college going culture or you're first generation and don't know about it, you kind of look back and discover the college town and the university has always been kind of present in some ways, whether it's from the books that our parents read or the books that I found at the library. And then I grew up in the majority of the time in Southern Colorado Springs, right outside of a military base. So that migratory kind of approach to growing up was there because I would stay, and every 2 or 3 years I'd have to make new friends. But it helped. It helped me helped me to be a little more extroverted.
Okay, the next question would be, given your interesting ethnic background, rich, diverse cultural Latinx tradition, meaning how you're Puerto Rican and your Ecuadorian origins, would you tell us how that background shaped your identity growing up?
A lot of people assume that Ecuador and Puerto Rico are have nothing and don't have a lot in common, as if they're on 2 different moons in the solar system. But it's kind of my natural heritage. Similar in my second book, The Siren World, I kind of took both as geographical identities, the island and the mountain. And both of them kind of intrigued me in different ways culturally, with the roots being the Spanish language that I did not learn as a child, that I continued to learn as an adult because I didn't have a proficiency before. And when it comes to the culture, a student earlier today during a visit asked, they didn't ask it this way, but they kind of said, what's your deal with your culture? Like, how do you explore it? And I said, well, it's because, my culture kind of shows it shows magic. It shows imagination. It shows mystery, adventure, and ghosts, and spirituality, and also the music and the everyday language that my parents and my family and that I have used with my friends and otherwise as well. And it's a part of me the same way that my 2 feet are a part of me as well.
And it's not an identity that is fixed. It's always moving. It's always changing and traveling between that magic aspect that you were just talking about?
Absolutely, because it's growing up, the first time I visited either Ecuador or Puerto Rico, they both happened to be when I was 14. When I was 14, I first went to Puerto Rico for my grandfather's funeral, or my father, on my paternal side, and that funeral was culture shock because yes, Puerto Rico is a commonwealth and considered a part of the United States, but my experience was just like traveling to another country, another culture. I didn't speak the language. My cousins teased me. They called me gringuito. My father slipped into the mode and called me gringuito as well. And it was obviously done with a lot of affection and care, but the insecurity and the uncertainty of not speaking the language definitely kind of left a lasting impression. And then a few months later, my family, we all went to Ecuador for the first time. And we take this long flight and we land in the Quito airport. And first thing we kind of go through the salida, the exit of the airport. And then what I see is there's like a chain link fence and there's all these faces smiling and little hands kind of waving through. And my mom turns to me and says, "That's your family." And I'm like, "I don't even know these people." And then the next moment, I'm put in a van with a bunch of cousins. My mom's put in another car with my dad, and then my sister's in another car. And then I'm kind of saying, "Wow, was I just kidnapped?" But immediately I could, and my family was trying to talk to me like, "How are you? How was your flight?" Just kind of standard conversation, but I couldn't speak it. So I was overwhelmed as well. But on that trip, I ended up spending 3 weeks there, and I got a little bit more comfortable, but I also kind of got homesick as well. So it kind of seems like that's one of the things about your culture and your heritage is there's moments of homesickness and there's also moments of comfort in who you are.
Would you say that you would have preferred to have done those trips when you were younger or a little older?
I think the timing was right. I mean, of course, I wish I could have went when I was younger, so I could probably have learned Spanish better and for other reasons. But I think it was a time in my life where my brain was malleable and susceptible to kind of learning my culture and just learning to be a decent human being. Because let's be honest, teenagers, that part of your life is when you're a very difficult person to be around. So I think that kind of instilled some humbleness in my identity, because I remember my mom said, "Juancito, when you go to Ecuador, you have to remember whatever they give you, you accept all the food. Do not be the picky American kid, because that's all they have, That's because that was the other reminder that was also the important part about these trips when I was a kid is learning about what I had in the United States growing up there versus what my family has and have had in Ecuador and Puerto Rico. So there was definitely this kind of global perspective. Obviously, as a 14-year-old, I wasn't able to kind of say, "Hey, check your privilege," but it was definitely a part of my life where I started to kind of acknowledge and check my privilege.
It was a good basis for your a good experience to pace yourself in learning about that.
Yes.
About that privilege.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's kind of a value in philosophy I try to pass on to my students when I'm teaching. They roll their eyes when I say check your privilege, or think about what you have and think about what you don't have. However, there are other moments when let's say I have a student that comes from a British and Scottish ancestry, and they kind of just look at me and say, "Well, I'm white, I have no culture," and so I have to remind them that they do, so that so it's not just about Latinx culture or Chicanx culture, or it's about everyone's culture. And I think that kind of being in a place at a university or just having writing as a platform to share my culture provides other people opportunities as well. I also love telling my students, paraphrasing W.H. Auden, the more specific you are, the more universal you become. And I continue to hold on to that advice.
Do you feel that the rich aspects of your identity gave you an advantage, open spaces, or on the contrary, did you ever feel alienated or even shame about performing those aspects of your identity in the American space? And how was it different at home, say in Ecuador and Puerto Rico, to the American space?
I think it depends on the situation. There's been several situations where I have felt alienation and isolation, and there's been other times where the opposite occurred. I can, and one of the things about those trips as a teenager immediately kind of reminded me of, when you leave this country, it's not about, you are an American to your family. That's who you are, gringuito. And so that, and boo hoo hoo was like the kind of mindset I had. Like they're like, oh, you poor alienated American in this other country. When you see a lot of issues and obstacles and hardships that my family has had to adapt to growing up and in their daily lives. So there's those aspects, but there's also an aspect like as a contemporary writer, when I go do a poetry reading in a community that's that is not very culturally diverse, those situations can kind of have a different kind of alienating effect where you're kind of exoticized, or I see other situations where people are exoticized in far worse circumstances. So, but over the years, I've been able to kind of, I think it's because of my teaching background that I've been able to kind of not get mad about it, but rather kind of say, okay, how can I learn from this, and how can I help people learn from this? Because I do have a poem in the Siren World called what I said one time when a woman called me Jose, and it's kind of like a poem that's a joke. People laugh, but there's also a message in there about just kind of assumptions and stereotyping with names, because I had a friend of mine, or one of the inspirations of that poem was a real situation where that happened. But also I had a friend that said, like, before she got to know me well, she's like, what's his name again? Juan Pedro or something like that. And I don't know. So it goes from there.
Yeah, and I read that poem as a learning experience to both the woman and yourself, or to the speaker in the poem.
Yeah.
It's a mutual learning experience.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about art, literature, and poetry. Can you tell us about your earlier experiences and early contact with art, either visual or the written world, or even music?
Okay, yeah. So I never, sometimes I think about it in the context of I kind of feel when I was younger that when I started to take writing and poetry seriously and art, I was blindsided by the fact that I wanted to be a writer. However, looking back, I've come to realize that I've always been writing. I've always been reading. And it could be, all these regular trips to the library, and when I was a kid, they had these like scholastic book fairs, and we'd have this thin newspaper that has like a listing of all these books, and then I'd go home, beg my mom for $20, which was a lot more back then, and she'd give me $20 or $5 or $10, and then I'd go and buy as many books as I could and read. And then when it came to writing, when it comes back to connected to the travel, when I started to travel, I would always find a notebook somewhere, and I would just journal everything that happened to me. So I kind of became this natural observer and wanted to kind of just document everything that happened. And so I had those trips to Ecuador and Puerto Rico as a kid. And then when I was in undergrad, I had the opportunity to go to England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, so like the British Isles, kind of backpacking with other college students. And I would do the same thing. I would hang out, I'd have a good time, and then I'd go find a corner and just write. and just kind of take in things. Like one of the fondest memories of that kind of example was 19 or 20 years old. We just get to England, and the first stop was Cambridge, like one of these historic university towns. And I'm sitting outside of the place we're staying, and I'm sitting on a bench just reading and writing in my journal, and there's just bikes everywhere, and because I love bikes. And then this Portuguese guy wearing only a towel and completely naked otherwise, comes out of the building, and he's just like, do you have a light? And he asked me for a light, and it turns out he got locked out of his room. He's naked, and then I just have this like really wild conversation with this naked Portuguese guy. And so I guess like going back to art and process, it kind of is just like even when you're just observing and kind of honing your craft in a journal, sometimes life will come to you and give you these weird and interesting circumstances to chronicle and document.
What I'm hearing is that you take the way life comes to you, be the art.
Yeah, I absolutely do. I try to be an open-minded person, and I try to like let things happen and do the standard classic wandering that should happen, or it's similar to being an adventurous eater. Once again, I have to give my mom credit to say you eat what they give you, but also it's just kind of, I think life and writing and art kind of comes from those experiences like, okay, what's the thing on the menu I don't recognize? What's the experience that's far away from my own, so I can kind of discover myself or connect with someone else in that way. And then the other forms of art that when I was growing up and in high school and college was I used to be in a ska band. So it was like a punk band with horns, and my friends were just like, hey, we're gonna start a band for the talent, or not the talent show, but for a performance next week. Do you want in? And I said, yes, I do, but I have no musical training. And so we spent the next 3 or 4 years learning about music, and they ended up being some pretty talented musicians, and I was the front man, and I connected to my writing, my growth as a writer, because once I started to get comfortable, I felt excited and compelled to start helping with the songwriting, with the lyrics, and I always kind of talk about how that helped me exercise and get rid of the cliches and the sentimentality and all the other things. But of course the writing was very immature, because it was we were like 19-year-olds doing punk music.
A different audience.
A different audience is a great way to put it. So,
do you remember the moment, the turning point? Well, I think you already mentioned it. There was no turning point for you. You always had that feeling that you wanted to be a writer. You were blindsided by it. That's the words you used.
Yes, that's right.
But why poetry? Why not become a
fiction writer?
A fiction writer.
I do give credit, because I do look back, and like a lot of writers and a lot of other people, I wanted to be a fiction writer because my style of poetry is very based in storytelling, and and it relies on the conventions of fiction with arcing, modular design, linear design, etc. But that kind of experience growing up with music and also doing like drama in high school, being a drama nerd, got me into the performance aspect. So I no disrespect to the fiction and the prose, but I think poetry gravitated me closer to the performative elements. So you have the performative elements, and then you also have like the economy of language that's kind of celebrated with poetry. And I think it's a great challenge to kind of say, okay, how can I express that emotion in that moment in 2 stanzas instead of 2 paragraphs or 2 pages or 20 pages for that matter.
Yeah, I can see how the way you consider art as something to play with, something to interact with, as opposed to writing fiction, which will be just to be passive and receiving the fiction.
Yeah.
And that comes across in your poems. Your poems are require the reader to play with what you have given us, with the story that you have given us.
Thank you.
We know that you look at history as a source for your own work. and the poetry of, say, Garcilaso de la Vega. Can you tell us about more contemporary writers that influence your work, either poets or fiction writers?
Absolutely, yeah. So Martin Espada is a poet I discovered while I was an undergrad, and he remains one of the first poets that I kind of discovered that there are writers kind of exploring culture in the same ways that I wanted to, and that I have been. Kim Araniso is another important poet of mine, where she kind of has that, she has like strong, honest, raw energy with her writing and her words that I would, that I always will aspire to kind of accomplish. And when it connects to my family's military connections, the poet Brian Turner is another one that I admire and respect for kind of about the craft of the war story and how it goes beyond documenting and chronicling combat. It also relates to how we interact with people after combat, or how we can heal the world or heal a community with, after combat as well. And I remain a big fan of Major Jackson. He's a great poet that I learn a lot from. And another poet that I see as a mentor is Rigoberto Gonzalez. He's a strong writer that is very invested in place. He also is very invested in body and physicality, and those things I think are with most of the influences these are writers that I admire and say I wish I could do that, and I want you to teach me how to do that when I read you. Is a big approach that I take into how I read and find writers that I admire.
Those poets that you just mentioned are not the usual white poets in the canon. We already mentioned Keats or T.S. Eliot or even James Tate. But those are not the influences that you tend to gravitate.
Well, I mean, say what you will about the canon. The canon is important, and I'm going to put air quotes on the canon if that's okay. I think those are important elements. It's similar to how at my university we still do have Shakespeare as a requirement. I like to joke that it's the dead white guy we want you to read, so you can get to know the other writers beyond, and regardless of culture and background. And I think you're absolutely right that I gravitate towards writers, that I can learn from, but also that have different cultural experiences, because I have a lot to learn as well culturally, as a citizen, and in relation to social justice issues that we can kind of see being critical in our country these days, because there's, for all the good that is in the world that is poetry, it also is the job of the poet to be an activist, and also to kind of connect communities, stand up for communities, preserve injustices, and on a similar note, I would cite the poet Carolyn Forche as an important influence, because when I was introduced to her work in graduate school and otherwise, this idea of poetry of witness really spoke to what I was trying to do and what I am doing. And so then now the next step is how can we take that up a notch?
That makes sense. And coming back to this poetry as something that we can do for the community.
Absolutely.
You earned your MFA from the University of New Mexico. Can you tell us how that experience influenced and molded your work and your decision to become an educator?
Yeah, absolutely. I at the University of New Mexico, I was, I believe the state motto for New Mexico is the land of enchantment, and then people that live there call it the land of entrapment. But I think either way, New Mexico is a magical place, and I was drawn to it because it kind of has that kind of gritty underdog identity that people kind of have unfairly assigned to it. And now I live in Pueblo, Colorado, and in the state of Colorado, Pueblo has that kind of gritty underdog, underestimated kind of aspect. So I was definitely drawn to New Mexico for that as well. But the stories, the history, the landscapes, the colors of the landscapes, the sunsets in southern Colorado and New Mexico are stunning. They surpass what I can do with poems. So it felt good to work there, to be there. And then when I did graduate from undergrad and went immediately into my MFA program, I was about 22 years old. So I was probably 3 years older than most of the students I was teaching in my English composition courses, and then eventually creative writing courses, as you know, like when I got to my second year. I do remember fondly this moment where I was like wearing a suit that didn't fit for me. I was overdressed. I walk into the classroom, everyone kind of casually looks back, kind of saying like, oh, it's some guy in a suit. And then I noticed they kind of got nervous and stiffened up, like, is this our teacher? And then I was their teacher, and, you know, everyone was giving us advice, like, you know, as a teacher, you have to, you know, the first time you're in the classroom, you have to kind of establish yourself. You have to kind of be a little harsher. You have to kind of be firm, and then you can kind of loosen up. But looking back, I that was definitely the wrong advice for me. It was more the better advice for me as a teacher was to kind of be yourself, you know, like the advice that your mom gives you when your feelings are hurt by your friends or maybe a girlfriend that broke up with you is like, just be yourself, it'll be okay. Because students can kind of see through who you're trying to be and who you are. So I think embracing who I was, or finding out how to embrace who I was, helped me with my writing and in entering the teaching profession and the university life.
That makes sense. In addition to your work as a poet, you're an educator. Can you tell us about the process that led you to this choice? It was just organic and you're still enjoying it?
Yeah. I originally, I never thought of myself as a teacher or being capable of having a leadership ability. But when I look back, I can kind of see the puzzle pieces kind of clicking together. My father, when he was in the military, he retired as a first sergeant, he retired as a sergeant major, but he was a first sergeant. So a big part of a big chunk of his military career was education in all kinds of capacities. Whether it was him yelling at new soldiers at boot camp, disciplining them. You know, he used to tell these great stories about like he would find a bag of marijuana, and then like he would get the soldiers, and instead of reporting them and getting them in trouble, he would just open the bag and he's like, you see this? This is all your money going down the drain, flush. And but he gained the respect of his soldiers because he didn't turn them in, and he turned it into learning opportunities. So those stories from my father, kind of in an interesting way, reminds me that I am part of a teaching lineage that was unexpected. And my mother, my mother's a very quiet person, but she's also kind of like she would kind of run holidays and family celebrations from behind the scenes and kind of be the glue that kept us all together and unified. So those types of leadership examples set me up for teaching. And then when I was an undergrad at CSU Pueblo, my first, I was a shoe salesman while I was in college, and that was like my last job in like that kind of area. And then I got a tutoring position on campus, and I started tutoring students one by one, and I was like, this is cool. You're not bad at this, so why not? Maybe teaching. But then what kind of sealed the deal was going to an MFA program where they said you have to teach. And then from there, I learned to feel very good and comfortable.
So it sounds like both the poetry and your career, you became what your family, or it was a big influence. The families are always a big influence in what we become.
Yeah. My family truly was an influence on and inspiration in a lot of ways. When it comes to writing poetry directly, there was never like a real urgency to write. until my mother and my father started telling these family stories. And it's almost cliche with, it would be later in the evening. And of course, my dad always both of them always drinking coffee all the time. And I'm like, how do you all sleep, with all this caffeine in your system? But they started telling these amazing stories that were hard to believe and so real that intangible, and that I was just, once again, going back to the notebooks, furiously writing them down so I could remember them. And then eventually, kind of after that, I would go to the computer and say, how can I put this together as a poem? How can I get the performative, compressed elements of that and tell their story at the same time? So it's always been a fun challenge in that regard. But the urgency came later as my parents got older, and they are, and I was just kind of, I have to put these stories down before it's too late, because we take so many things for granted in our lives, and so I'm grateful that we have all these stories for my family and my parents. And the way I look at it is it was the way that I could kind of pay back the family and thank them for everything they gave to me.
Yeah, as a poet, you're like the family historian in these books.
Yeah, I agree.
So in relationship to language and from the poems in your 3 collections, it seems you've always been aware about being bilingual and how it creates tension, at least with the Spanish. Do you find that you integrate Spanish into your poems? The way you integrate Spanish into your poems, does it come as an organic process, or is it polished through revision?
So I would say the Spanish in the poetry that I write comes more organically. It comes more organically in the sense of, or in the moments where that's how I heard it, that's how I received it, and also on the rhythmic level, that this is the more appropriate word that I should be using versus the more polished academic word for what I'm trying to communicate. So I don't know if authenticity is the right word, but the more natural word, I think, is kind of, the more natural word and instance of that moment is what I'm trying to capture. When it comes to the polish, making sure it's accurate, make sure the accents are in the correct places, making sure that it's an enya versus an n, and a lot of the small nuanced elements. Once again, like the professor nags his students, you have it as polished as possible so the formatting doesn't get in the way of what the writing's really trying to convey.
I was repeating this question because we already talked about it.
Yeah.
But, hopefully for the audience that have assignments, like I do have an assignment for next weekend, that I have to come up with a bilingual poem, and I'm still trying to consider how to frame it, and whether I should start with either Spanish or with English, and how to integrate the two of them. Mm-hmm. So insights like those, and because like the way you integrate them, it sounds like it's organic. It doesn't sound like over polished.
Right.
That's the reason I was mentioning this question again.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the small thing I would add to that is that a lot of times that if you're forcing it too much, you're gonna feel it, and then in turn the reader's gonna feel that as well. So they're gonna kind of see through it. So that kind of continued hard mission of staying true to what you want to say and how goes a long way.
Yeah, it brings us back to the same thing about authenticity.
Yes, yeah.
Being our true selves in the poems.
Yeah.
Is there one poem that you will illustrate the multilingual aspect we were discussing just right now, and would you read it for us?
Yeah. Wow. Yes. Let me see. So many to choose from. Let's see here.
Maybe the one I was thinking more specifically, the one where your father learns English.
Let's do it. I know what you're talking about. Perfect. Thank you. And I'll just read it. How my father learned English. 382nd Hospital, Japan, 1952. The wounded who could not speak English congregated around the bedridden every morning. Manuel, the nurse from some other ward, taught my father and others English, word by word. Sometimes the phrases, the sloppy, repeated English made sense. Because es porque. Porque is because. Dolor es pain, y pain is dolor. Yo soy es I am. I am. Otra vez díganme. Because. Pain. I am in pain. English moved my father's tongue unlike Spanish. It stuck in his mouth, stumbled past his teeth. He dreamed he forgot Spanish and his tongue withered away. My father never told anyone about this or the scratching fear of his legs under bandages and scars, never walking again. He didn't have the words in English yet.
I think that poem illustrates like how it flows without any sense of inauthenticity, if we can call it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
There is a clear and marked movement that indicates the evolution from Friday to the end of times.
Yeah.
One would consider the end of times a more personal, and I personally enjoy it more because of its romantic undertones.
Thank you.
It has been considered a meditation on grief. However, the other poignant issue it addresses is an ecological concern, the awareness of humanity's reckless destruction of our own home. Would you comment on that, and how do you see the role of the poet in addressing those issues, ecological issues and preservation?
So I guess the way I would start to answer this question is going back to the concept of poetry of witness, where Carolyn Forche sums up kind of the intersection of the personal and the political kind of coming together into that social space. And even though it includes zombies and horror movies and things like that, on the personal space, The Handyman's Guide to End Times was an opportunity to bring in the horror movies and the zombies and the other things that I'm obsessed with, but also on a voice level, it felt like a right opportunity to also start to introduce more humor and humor and more dimensions of the voice. So in those ways, it's a very personal book and project, and obviously the grief connects to the failing of a marriage as well. So all of that kind of intersecting with home improvement and the house and things like that, and then the house becomes a larger metaphor for the environment, for our planet, and for the places where we reside. So, I hope readers kind of take the humor, the zombies, and the love poetry as kind of also mixed in with the reminder that we have to be good stewards for our environment. We have to recognize the mistakes we make and learn from those mistakes so we can kind of work to preserve the environment. There's a poem in here that kind of talks about when, in a time when it was good enough to recycle. Because environmentally, it seems like we're moving towards an era where it's just not enough to be sustainable. We have to start to do more than that. We have to replant and regrow the environment and save it. And I hope conversations that start with zombies can kind of start into environmental concerns. When this book came out in September of 2018, I was doing a lot of readings around the same time as the 2018 election, which are midterm elections, which a lot of people in the United States kind of see as less important elections. And I used to joke during those readings, don't make this book come true. But also a lot of people kind of see like our current political situation as like, well, this book is kind of spot on about what's going on. It is the apocalypse out there. And, going back to the points we were talking about with activism and poetics, that I hope the words on the section of personal and environmental things can kind of prompt action. Whether, and that could be like, you know what, I am going to go volunteer at this place in my community, or, well, I'm going to write my own zombie poem about environments.
And yeah, it sounds like you're promoting compassion and community as opposed to competition. Like I'm speaking specifically about the poems with the gardener snakes and the poem about the cockroach. Like,
oh, yes, yeah.
Like you look at all those lesser or repulsive forms of life, and you embrace them.
Yeah, yeah, I do. I'm the kind of guy in my household where if I find a spider in the house, I'm gonna catch it and then go free it outside, you know. Or if it's like growing up, my mom would always be going around the house going, mosca, 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 and like she'd open the door and try to shoo the flies out instead of swatting them and killing them. So yeah, there's definitely this idea of compassion and towards being life affirming, ironically in an apocalyptic setting, because when it comes to shows like The Walking Dead and The Apocalypse, Zombieland and other fun zombie movies, there's always like these sets of codes for survival, and usually the message becomes don't trust people, they're the real threats, because we're competing for resources, we're going to take each other out and we're going to betray each other in those situations. But then later on in the movie or in the TV show, you kind of realize that the message is love, that the message is we do need community to kind of band together and to survive and to rebuild. Those are always the kind of missions and mantras connected to the horror, is surviving the horror by going through a process of fighting and then coming together. And
it brings us to the poem Turf Wars, where again it's a thing about community, it's a thing about learning. It's not about competition.
Absolutely, yeah. And the poem Turf Wars, it is a poem about a bunch of us being high schoolers and trying to drink underage at the pool hall and competing with migrant workers over what we get to play on the jukebox. So yeah, it's kind of a humorous situation, and instead of kind of walking out of that situation kind of like, these guys are jerks and I'll never trust a migrant worker ever or anything. The moment of connection there is kind of like, well, they're people too. Los Tigres del Norte aren't that bad. And also kind of a reminder of like, we can learn from each other, and it's okay to get humbled by not being as good at pool as they were.
And yet you learn that humility at an early age, so it shows.
I tried, yes.
One of my favorite poems in End Times is Across the Overrun States, because the way I see it, the poem manages to bring all those concerns, the end of time, impermanence, romance, fear, and the search for a home. Will you read us that poem too, and give us an insight as to what it means to you?
Yes, I would, yeah, happy to do it. And of course, this is the moment where you have to find it. I believe it's towards the beginning. There it is. Across the overrun states. I'm smart enough to brace for government's collapse. The great zombie buildup paraded down the boulevard behind the four horsemen in the ozone spewed black, by Yellowstone erupting and the solar storms shorting out all our circuits. But there are fears I dodge in the assumptions we'd be together. There is no plan beyond the tool bag I should have packed and a few bottles of water rolling around in the back of my car, and the lack of courage to ask if you want me to pursue you at all. I should check if I have enough lumber to board up my windows and doors, shaking off the probability of being an early-on casualty. But I can't decide if home is where I take a stand or if I'm supposed to abandon it.
That's okay. Cool.
Thank you. So process-wise, there are a few things that I was kind of doing when I built this poem is, if you kind of look at it, there's a lot of criteria for zombie movies. There's the issue of, the probability of being an early on casualty. We always kind of think we're going to be the survivor, but more realistically, you're going to be part of the 90% of the population that does not make it in the beginning. That you're in the first minute and a half of the movie, screaming and burning or getting bit up or whatever, but also, ironically or funny enough, that this one kind of also is riffing on rom-coms, romantic comedies, where it's kind of, the moment where it's just kind of like, oh, we're not together, but then, no, wait, I'll run to the airport and profess my love to you. So there's this kind of complacency and defeatist attitude kind of being confronted and addressed because, oh, the apocalypse is happening. Is this a moment where I'm going to go after you and kind of say we're meant to be together, or do I kind of bunker down and take care of myself and just try to survive? And when it comes to relationships, determining the right thing or the wrong thing to do. And also, there's also a reference here to, the water bottle rolling around in the car, connected to, are we ever really prepared for the apocalypse? I know there are preppers, there are people that build bunkers and all these other aspects. But I kind of think that this poem appears early on in the book to kind of establish that it's okay to not know the answer right away. You will find the answer. It might not be a good answer, but you will find it.
In the first collection, Friday, when writing about Ecuador and Puerto Rico in such compartmentalized fashion, do you find it was easier to write about one place and not the other? How would you characterize those sources in terms of ease with which they were accessible, both Ecuador and Puerto Rico?
One was not easier than the other. They both felt accessible to me because of my travels there early on, because of my family in both places still, and because both of my parents, despite both of them kind of suffering and experiencing PTSD, my father because of his experience in the military with the different wars he was in, and my mother experiencing PTSD connected to her to a cataclysmic earthquake she survived when she was 10 years old. They both suffered from PTSD, but one of the surprising things that I'm grateful for is that they both were willing and able to talk about these things, because I understand a lot of veteranos and a lot of people that go through trauma and difficult experiences don't want to, will not, or cannot speak about them and get them documented. So once again, I think it's an example of how they demonstrated a bravery to kind of tell these stories, and I learned from that bravery to kind of say, okay, how can I work on writing about these places without feeling pressured? However, a form of pressure I did feel, I've always felt, is that I wanted to make sure I equally pay attention to both sides of my family, because they're different directions of geography. So there were times where I'm writing about Ecuador, the Inca, my mother, and I kind of feel like, oh gosh, I had to swing the pendulum back and make sure I'm talking about Puerto Rico, I'm talking about my father, and back and forth. So that's definitely always going to be some sort of balance and struggle that is going to be part of the writing process. Instead of feeling discouraged about it, like all good writing has tension at the heart of it. So I think I'm still learning, but I'm feeling good about using that tension to kind of engage the reader and tell the story in a more intriguing manner.
So yeah, it's a matter of balance, but it's also responsibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your parents were willing to talk, but you were also willing to listen. You wanted to listen to bring us these stories.
Yeah, and I'm grateful that I'm grateful I had the time to listen to them. I'm grateful, that In the case of my father, I'm grateful he lived long enough to tell me these stories, and I'm grateful that my mother as well, that they both, that the timing allowed ourselves to let this dialogue happen, this important dialogue.
The blurb by Bernd Rusala in the back of Friday and the Year That Follow, it says, "We're shown the kind of magic one associates with 100 years of solitude." How do you feel about that comparison? Do you feel it's accurate?
I feel it is too generous. As a poet in the U.S., to have any comparison to 100 Years of Solitude I'm not comfortable with it, because 100 Years of Solitude is an important influence and legend to me. But I do appreciate that the blurb and the generous writer who wrote it was able to see Garcia Marquez called it brick-faced storytelling when he talks about how spirituality and ghosts and legends are talked about. He said his grandmother would talk about the ghosts in the town and the everyday things and the violence, everything kind of with that casual thing, matter-of-factly. So it kind of removed that moment of hesitation and belief where you're kind of like, did this happen? It didn't matter if it happened or not. It's true to it's true to the story. So I appreciate the blurb and the poet kind of seeing that I do want to embrace the brick-faced storytelling that occurs in Garcia Marquez's work and moving forward in the work that I do, whether it's fictionalized zombies or writing about ghosts, spirits, and family.
Now, there's not a lot of religion, organized religion. Yeah. I didn't hear any experience of the experience you were commenting early on about growing up evangelical because your parents were, but there's a lot of spirituality. Can you talk about it to the audience?
Yeah. So when it comes to organized religion, I stopped going to church when I was a preteen, and that decision did not eliminate spirituality from my life, and instead it kind of similar to other people that are looking for answers when it comes to faith and spirituality. As a preteen, I was trying to figure out life in general, but on that spiritual side, it was the same thing. One of my older sisters, she, based on blended families, I have a sister that's 20 years older than me, so she was more like an aunt versus a sister in the way that our relationship was. But of course, she's my sister. And I have nephews that are the same age as I am, which is interesting in its own right. Every weekend, she would take us to the mountains. And we would go hiking, we'd go fishing, we'd go camping. So we would just experience the wilderness and the woods. And just like my friends now that love to go skiing and snowboarding in Colorado, they'll someone will make a sarcastic joke like, the mountains are my church, or nature is my church. However, that there really is something there to it. There's definitely that kind of spiritual value that connects to being in the elements, being outdoors, getting the fresh air, and having time. I'm a very extroverted person that likes to talk, I've been told, but also as I get older, I recognize there are moments where silence is equally critical, and contemplation and things like that, and all of that feeds into this idea of spirituality with nature as well. So I think I would kind of argue, even if it's nature being threatened or other countries through the lens of a gringuito, it is kind of using spirituality in the sense of that. And poetry is ritual, poetry is incantation, and poetry also relies on rhythm and prayer. So all of these, so it makes perfect sense that whether it's the spooky stuff or the war stories or just the family stories, that they all kind of converge into be like a spiritual experience.
And it's interesting because you mentioned how your mother was trying to get you involved into religion. But she was also the one that told you the stories about the curandera, and she wanted you to tell those stories too. So it's important how we keep that tradition and how our mothers keep that tradition.
Yes, absolutely. There was my parents never like directly said it before, but I think there was kind of an urgency, like, hey, one of our children are asking and listening to us. We need to tell them this while we can. So there was definitely that aspect of it. But you're right. I do recognize the contradictions that, the church that they went to was very strict and very, I'll just say strict. So they were very strict, and so there was no dancing. There was, the music was very a particular type. There's no such thing as ghosts. Curanderas, that's a witchcraft, those types of kind of hardline stances. The contradictions occurred where she's telling me these stories, about my grandmother being my great-grandma. Yes, grandma, sorry. My grandmother being a curandera and doing these healing rituals, and my mom tells them with such strong belief that this really happened. And meanwhile, my father would tell me these casual ghost stories, like I'm writing about it now for the next book, or it'll appear in some new writing of some sort in the near future. He tells me a story about where he was like pulling guard duty in this office building in Panama that used to be a hospital. And the soldiers talked about how this was a haunted building. And so my father said, like, well, instead of pulling guard, I would just sit in the office, turn on the baseball game, and read a magazine, and just listen to the ghosts go at it outside. The elevators would go on their own. He'd hear footsteps and things like that. But usually, like, the next step is when it comes to that, my father would say, well, it wasn't real. But instead, he was just kind of like, yeah, the ghosts did their thing, I did my thing, it was fine. So those mixtures of belief always are I still don't have an answer for them.
I think it comes in the books. I think I will consider the siren world to contain the most research. Can you talk a little more about the research that you conducted in order to?
Yes. To finish the book?
Yes.
Yeah, the Siren World was originally a completely different book. It was going to be this epic, cinematic rise and fall of the Incan Empire, colonialism, like the Spaniards sweep in and conquer them, and basically this long chronicle. So I read a lot of chronicles, a lot of history books, including ones about Guamapoma, Garcilaso de la Vega. So I was reading about these kind of these different historical figures. And a book and a long poem that I cut from this was called "Peddling the New World," and it was basically a poem written completely in second person about a poor Spaniard that is enlisted, recruited, and then sails across the ocean with Pizarro to come to the New World because he has no opportunities. So it becomes kind of like a past reflection of the immigration experience in that way. Obviously, that poem didn't make the cut because there was books are always, in the writing process, the projects are always evolving. It wasn't working, and so I cut 40 pages of these conquistador Incan Empire poems, and then I had a moment of panic. I said, well, now I have 20 or 30 pages of poems that are good, but I don't have a book anymore. What am I going to do? And then meanwhile, I had a pile of Puerto Rico poems based on my travels there, and said, like, well, what if I wove them together? Can it be a book? And surprisingly, it fit together, and it came together fast. So, and then from there, the newer version, the new incarnation of that book found a publishing home fairly quickly after that, after so much rejection. Because this book was rejected like 92 times.
So you just have to keep working even after all the rejections.
Yeah, my students are very tired of me talking about the theme of persistence, the theme of determination. And I'm not trying to be like an athletic shoe commercial or anything like that. Like, you can do it and it'll always work out. That's not what I'm just trying to tell them that it does take hard work to get published. It does take hard work and determination and persistence to get 3 rejections from from 3 different literary magazines in 1 week, and then feel hopeful enough to send the poems back out 2 days later. But I also do kind of remind my students, being for my experience and background, if I can do it, ¿por qué no? Why can't you do it? That becomes the motivational TED Talk portion of the conversation, where, I hope that hopefully they feel like they can do it if that's the right path for them.
And when you were talking about evolution and how projects change as they are occurring, I think we can see traces from each book going into the next book.
Yeah, absolutely. For example, the last poem in Friday in the Year That Followed is a poem about the Nazca lines, and it talks about a Spanish conquistador named Pedro Ciza de Leon looking at the Nazca lines. And so a conquistador appears in the end of this book, and then this book is rampant with conquistadors in indigenas and the Inca. And then in the Siren World, I was subtly sneaking in horror movie tropes excuse me, in that book, and the next project kind of embraced the horror and the personal elements. And then also similar timeline and trajectory, going back to every writing project should challenge the poet to improve, or once you get comfortable with one style or one method, you have to move on to something else. So the first one is all storytelling and family. And then the second one was a response to that, kind of saying, you have to be a participant in these stories. And then the third one, Handyman, became a poem about, I'm going to show you my humorous side, and I'm going to show you the zombies and the skeletons and all the other monsters that are under the closet, that are in the closet, under the bed, and outside of the windows.
And I guess we can predict that compassion and your respect for all living life will continue in your next project when you're talking about ghosts and
that's
about your father.
Yeah, that's the hope with the next book, and the goals and aspirations to it is the next book will focus on honoring my father's life and the loss of it, as well as family and also kind of showing how in moments of grief we have to celebrate that life, and we still have to find ways to laugh. We have to find other ways to keep telling the stories and remembering them, because when we lose someone, you do forget what their voice sounds like. You do forget what their face looks like. But there are moments where writing can give us the opportunity to see them again or hear them again for just a moment. And it feels very personal and uncomfortable to write about. So I'm going to take that as a sign that I'm on the right track.
It's a challenge.
Absolutely.
I think I run through all of my questions. Do you have any final remarks, any advice for MFA students?
For MFA students, just remember that you are going to suffer. I'm kidding, obviously, but you are going to suffer. But also that you belong here, that there are going to be moments where it feels too hard, or you might be you might be in a part of a journey where you assume or see someone else thriving when you're not. That's not the case. There are various circumstances, but you do belong here. You are here to learn, and let those various complicated, hard emotions kind of find their way into the poetry, so that way. I'm not saying that writing is always therapy, but there should be a therapeutic element in healing and connection with the poetry. because because I know some people say like, well, it's about the art, but there is an art to healing. There is definitely an art to connecting and communicating and finding compassion and mindfulness. Because my partner recently told me she read an article on the Atlantic that was talking about how the younger generation is not as thoughtful and compassionate, but it's our generation's fault for not teaching it to them. So, but going back to the MFA situation, it's not too late to learn compassion. It's not too late to learn how to write. It's not too late to find the right writing. So all of these lessons and all of this timing kind of work together and be open to it, embrace the community that is around you, find the community that you need, but also make sure you get out beyond the campus and experience things so you can kind of find what that book should be.
And it brings us back to the concept of persistence.
Yes.
And we're not doing poetry for the money or no. For economic success or position.
No.
Is to be part of the community and help our communities.
Yeah, and when it comes to publishing, I never thought it possible to publish a book. So the fact that I've published 3 books, I'm ahead of any goals that I set out to achieve, and I'm just kind of like, okay, what can I do now? Is the next way to look at it. Not to feel complacent, but to kind of say, okay, what other challenges out there? What other book can I try to write and write also? And yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for sharing your insights and your work with us. We're pleased to have you at Notre Dame.
Thank you for having me on campus, and thanks to the Institute for Latino Studies. Thank you to Notre Dame, and thank you to you for the great questions.